Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Richard McCabe. As chairman of the Friends of the Bodley, I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's annual lecture. The meeting is, of course, virtual, but the friendship and the benefits it brings to the library are very real, and we remain enormously grateful to you for your continuing support during these rather difficult times, and we hope to return to normal functioning when conditions permit. Now, this evening, it's my great pleasure to introduce our two distinguished speakers, Laura Wade and Samuel West. Laura Wade is an eminent playwright. She studied drama at Bristol University and was later a member of the Young Writers Programme at the Royal Court Theatre. Many of you will already be familiar with her impressive body of work, which includes plays such as Limbo, 16 Winters, Young Emma, Tipping the Velvet until recently, and Alice, a reworking of Alice in Wonderland. In 2010, coming closer to home and perhaps a little too close, her play Posh had a sellout run downstairs at the Royal Court in London. The play famously depicts the antics of the Riot Club, an exclusive Oxford University dining club, a club that I should say is of an entirely fictional nature and bears no relation to any known society or indeed any blonde politician. More recently, in 2019, Laura won the Olivier Award for the Best New Comedy for her ingenious play, Home, I'm Darling. Now, this evening, Laura will be in conversation with Samuel West, who is a distinguished actor and director. He read English here at Oxford at Lady Margaret Hall and was president of the Experimental Theatre Club. Since then, he has appeared frequently on stage and screen, both the large screen and the small screen. In particular, I would mention his 2 seasons with the Royal Shakespeare Company, which saw him give a much admired performance in the title role in Richard II. In 2002, Samuel began his career as director with a revival of Christopher Fry's The Ladies Not for Burning at the Minerva Theatre, Chichester. And 5 years later, in 2007, he began directing at the West End with a revival of Patrick Marber's play, Dealer's Choice. He's been nominated for 3 Olivier Awards, 1 as actor, 2 as director, and a BAFTA for Best Supporting Actor in Howard's End. Now, both of our speakers enjoy powerful independent reputations in the theatre, but the conversation between them that you're about to hear this evening it focuses on their collaborative work on Jane Austen's unfinished novel, The Watsons. You'll remember that the manuscript of The Watsons was acquired by the Bodley in 2011 with the active support of the Friends, amongst many other generous sponsors. Laura adapted The Watsons for the stage, and it premiered in November 2018 to great acclaim at the Chichester Festival Theatre under Samuel's direction. And it's that interaction between writing and directing that we're about to explore this evening. So now, without any further ado, I shall hand over to tonight's speakers.
Hello.
Hi, everyone. Hello.
We made a video entrance. I think that might be my first one.
It's very exciting. We should probably say, first of all, that we are actually partners. We're not breaking social distancing by
we just happen to be in each other's kitchen.
Live in the same house. So thank you so much for that, Richard. What a lovely introduction. And thank you for having us. We're really, really honoured to be asked to be here this evening. It feels like such an honour, and also we love talking about the Watsons, don't we?
Rather more than we like talking about anything else. Actually.
Yeah, mainly because it means we can take a break from talking about our 2 children. And the Bodleian, obviously, an amazing and auspicious place where, I mean, you must have spent quite a lot of time in there.
Yes, not as much as I should have done. Richard pointed out I was at LMH in 85 to 88. I did get into the habit, but I did too many plays, really. And now, although I don't live in Oxford, I still love working in libraries. I work at the British Library in King's Cross, and it always reminds me of the Bod. So yes, very happy memory. And you?
Well, obviously I went to Bristol, so...
You won't hold that against you.
Yeah, that was a massive Russell Group chip on my shoulder. No, I filmed there when for the Riot Club.
Oh, which I was in. Yes, I should have known that.
You weren't in that scene though. You weren't there that day. We filmed a very quick, like sort of 10 scenes in a day, in the library. So I associate being inside that building with a sort of vague sense of unease, and like events are slipping out of my control, which is quite a lot what it's like being a writer on the film set anyway. So yeah, so I'm really looking forward to a point in the future where we can go back and be there in person. But for now, we are here virtually in our kitchen.
Yes, thank you, Richard, for acknowledging that it's sad not to be meeting in person. It is. I think it's quite extraordinary that we're able to do this virtually, and indeed have probably a reach more national and probably easier to get to for many people. But even if only digitally, we hope that you feel as much joy in sharing this moment with us as we have in doing it. We really are delighted to be here. And we're very sad not to be able to invite people to the show, because even if it wasn't doing very well, it would probably still be running in the West End. It was due to open last month, and the whole run was cancelled in April. So we have a cast of 17, 14 of whom have been in it before, 2 of whom are new and have never rehearsed it. And that's a very strange situation for them. It's a production that doesn't have a lot of stars in it. So although the producers are making all sorts of the right noises, it may be that it's not seen in the West End. And as a result, I'm going to give you a bit of a précis of it as quickly as possible in a moment, because I'm not going to assume that you've seen it.
Yeah, we're not going to worry too much about plot spoilers, are we?
No, just in case there is no plot ever again.
I have high hopes that it will come back, and that people will be able to book and see it next year. So if you're a plot spoiler person, then maybe cover your ears at that point.
I think apart from anything else, people need the laughs. So.
Yeah, it's quite a fun play, isn't it?
Mm. We should say, really, that we're here because of the extraordinary generosity that Richard referred to, the fundraising efforts that you and the Jane Austen House and the Treasury and everyone else made to buy the manuscript of the Watsons.
Mm.
And another thing that we didn't get to do.
No, we had a school trip booked with the company of the play on the 17th of April. We were all going to squash into a room and have a look at and everybody was so excited about the idea of going and being in the room with that actual artifact.
I think it would have been a very special day for the cast, and certainly for us. And very newsworthy too. We were hoping to be able to bring attention to the fact that you had it and we loved it and we were doing a play about it. And sadly that hasn't happened. But again, we will hope for that in the future.
Mm. And we were very lucky to have Professor Catherine Sutherland come, who is with us this evening, I think. Hello, Catherine. Who was a great friend to the show and came and spoke to us in the company. I remember very movingly about the manuscript
thing itself,
and what it was like and what it represented, and everybody was very taken with it. We should probably talk a bit first about though what the play is, what it's about.
I mean, you bought it, you probably read it, but in case you haven't, we have what is probably a fifth of a normal Jane Austen length novel, and the story as such is that our heroine, a 19-year-old girl called confusingly Emma Watson, but she was first, who was recently returned to her family home after being brought up by a rich aunt in Shropshire, because the aunt's remarried and the new husband doesn't like her. So she's sent back to Surrey, to a town that's to a village on the outskirts of a town that sounds very much like Dorking, with her poor family, poorish family. Her father, who's a vicar, is ill in bed and being cared for by Emma's older sister Elizabeth, who's 28 years old, unmarried and a bit stuck. And it becomes clear that the sisters really do need to get married as soon as possible. And this problem hangs over the whole story, because once their father dies, they won't have any money. Emma goes to a ball quite soon, quite early on. In fact, the first scene of the fragment is Elizabeth driving her to it. And she meets a succession of potential suitors. We have Tom Musgrave, who is the cad, who everybody knows and nobody takes seriously. Lord Osborne, who's a sort of awkward Darcy type, and rather shy and rather brusque. And Mr. Howard, a clergyman who is a friend of their father's, who's the only one she dances with and who we think she might be quite taken with, except he might be a bit serious. We also meet Emma and Elizabeth's brother Robert, who's an attorney in Croydon and has made a good marriage with a rather fierce woman called Mrs. Robert, who likes being a big fish in a small pond. And Emma's older sister Margaret, Emma's other sister, and indeed older, sister Margaret, who's a bit of a schemer and desperate to find a husband. We just get the setup. The sisters are desperate to marry, the father's about to die. We get an early suitor, Lord Osborne, who meets Emma, is too shy to talk to her at the ball, but gets Tom, his wingman, to chat her up, and then visits her the next day. And Emma, who's had to come from this rather good life in Shropshire to a small place where they have to fold the linen in the kitchen and everything smells of burnt meat, and there's only one servant and she's rather overworked and a bit rude, thinks, well, I'd rather like to have a long gallery to walk in when it was raining and a horse of my own and a few more servants. And when Lord Osborne decides that he likes her enough to propose marriage to her, she says yes. And this is roughly the point where Jane Austen leaves off the story. There's more, which we'll go into later. But Laura Wade's adaptation of the Watsons, which I should say is the only adaptation there's ever been of the Watsons, which is why I'm telling you this in this detail, on stage, screen, or radio.
Drama adaptation.
Yeah, there's been many refinishings, but in
yeah.
terms of an adaptation in another format. At the point where Lord Osborne says, would you like to be the next Lady Osborne? And Emma says yes. A servant who we haven't seen before says, no! And they turn around and say, I'm sorry, who are you? And the servant, who's deeply embarrassed, manages to get rid of Lord Osborne and then sit down Emma and say, this is so embarrassing, this is so unprofessional. Have you ever heard of somebody called Jane Austen? And Emma says, no. And it turns out, over the next scene, which is difficult and just the two of them, about 15 minutes long, that Laura has to explain to Emma that she's fictional and that she's in a book, well, now a play. And Emma, as you can imagine, doesn't take it very well. She gets up and runs away and goes to the end of the road and comes back with mud on her dress and says, and Laura says, what happened? And she said, well, I got to the end of the road and there's nothing there. And Laura says, no, I haven't written that bit yet.
Which I totally stole from the Truman Show.
Which you totally stole from the Truman Show, but we steal from good places, you see. We steal from the best. Briefly, it sort of goes quite well after that. Emma learns to trust Laura, and Laura's got these notes from Jane Austen's sister Cassandra, who Cassandra told to Jane Austen's niece, and they were written down later, that might be how Jane Austen wanted to finish the book, or thought it might finish. We don't know why she stopped. And that would all be fine, and they decide who she might marry, except then Lady Osborne, the awkward Lord Osborne's mother, who's just elected herself a spokeswoman for the group, comes to the door, followed by the entire cast. 16 people go into this tiny room, and then Lady Osborne says to Laura, we know who you are. And you couldn't help overhearing, and the clergyman says it's rather difficult from a religious point of view. And it turns out that they've been listening and they've discovered they're all fictional. And rather than taking it hard, they've decided to turn up and be helpful with Laura's difficulty. What do they say?
They're going to offer. They've come to offer their input.
So they're already getting
which is not something a writer likes to hear.
Yes, they've already got the language of the difficult producer. And then Laura's phone goes, which is in her costume, and they've never seen one before, and it's the producer saying, where's my draft? And Laura realizes that she has to get it done. Curtain, end of Act 1. Act 2, to run through it very quickly, is starts with an enormous scene where everybody's arguing about what should happen. Laura gives the characters her plan drawn from Jane Austen about what she thinks should happen, and they're not very impressed. They want to do more interesting things, more exciting things. They have a big vote as to whether they're allowed to decide their own destiny, which Laura narrowly loses by one vote, 52-48, as it were. Remember Brexit? That seems a bit old-fashioned now, doesn't it?
Yeah, Brexit jokes,
and then at that point, in order to regain control of the story, as it were, Laura announces that Mr. Watson, the girl's father, is dead. and Nanny comes in saying, "It's your father," and she's killed him. She's written him out. And Emma at this point goes completely rogue and rebels and has sex with a soldier, and then the others, two of the senior ladies, fall in love with each other and plan to elope. That's Nanny and Lady Osborne, and everybody just does what they want. And there's a mad scene at the end where everything that they say they want to happen happens, and there's a rave and a spaceship arrives, and it goes very, very silly for about 3 minutes. And then Emma says, "No, that's not it," and banishes them all. And the final scene is her and Laura talking, and her saying to Laura, "Could I become a writer?" And Laura says, "Oh no, don't become a writer." But Emma is insistent, and so Laura leaves her to it, and as a parting gift gives her a notebook. And the final line,
and also having realised that perhaps the reason Jane Austen didn't finish her,
this is important, sorry,
is that perhaps Jane Austen realised that by writing Emma's story, she was giving her only one of an infinite number of possibilities, and that if she were to leave Emma unfinished, then
the possibilities were
that
endless.
left Emma in a position where she had endless possibilities of lives that she could lead. And that felt like, for a modern audience, the best place we could put her, because it didn't feel right to marry her off at that point, did it? And sort of pack her back in the box.
She wouldn't go back in. So the final line is Emma saying to the 10-year-old boy who's a friend, "This is what I think should happen." And she writes her own future and becomes a writer.
And we had a very beautiful lighting effect.
Where the walls breathed. The whole walls seemed to breathe.
I just had a very strong memory while you were talking through that of, we mostly had very lovely audience responses to the play, and people really got it and really enjoyed the playfulness of it. But I remember in an early preview, one couple deciding to leave at the audience and being heard very loudly saying on the way out of the theatre, "Well, they've clearly got no intention of finishing it."
Yes, that was extremely unfair, wasn't it? Because actually, if you'd stayed for the second half, you would realise that we ended about 4 times.
Yeah, it wasn't short of endings.
No, possibly had slightly too many. I think one of the things that I should say about this is that we do, albeit in quite quick form, because we recognise in the fragment, even as it exists, quite a lot of Jane Austen types, that we gave the audience for 25 minutes as good an adaptation of the Watsons as we possibly could, because we wanted the people who really loved Jane Austen and loved the fact that there was a surviving fragment, which was actually a manuscript in her hand, the only one we have, to discover what happens in it, because on the whole, people don't know. I think I've talked for enough now. You say something.
I mean, it was all done with a huge amount of affection.
That's important to say.
Yeah, I think so. It was certainly written by someone who hugely loves Jane Austen, and puts it, and rehearsed by a company. And I mean, I saw you in Persuasion before I even met you, so you've had a
talking of those
Jane Austen
dreadful
history.
Times before we met. This play began before we met, so I wanted you to talk about where it came from.
Yes, it's that long ago. This play has had the longest gestation of anything I've written, and I started work on it in about 2005, 2006. I mean, pre-iPhone, isn't it? As a marker, and I was looking for an adaptation to do. A producer had asked me to do an adaptation of something that was was famous enough to bring an audience through the door. And I was kind of trying to go through the back door a little bit in terms of finding something that I could do something a bit playful with, rather than just doing another Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights or Pride and Prejudice. So I happened upon a book of the unfinished Jane Austen pieces, and really loved the Watsons when I read it, and wanted to read on and find out what had happened to these characters, particularly Emma. And in thinking about how to bring it to the stage, had this idea that it didn't have to be just a finishing that it could be a play about what happens to a set of characters when their author abandons them, because the why she abandoned them was always very interesting to me. And I hooked on quite early to the idea that this was in the middle of her career because of the 6 Jane Austen books. This comes after the first 3 and before the last. So it wasn't so many unfinished things. Sanditon, for example, are unfinished because the author has died and hasn't got to finish it. But this wasn't. This was something that she'd chosen to put away, and that I found really interesting as another writer. That she bottom drawed it. And the producer I was working with really loved this idea of this kind of playful thing that what do the characters do, because it's a really good concept. But
it owes a little bit to Pirandello, which our play acknowledges.
Yeah.
But I think it's Parce, Luigi. I think it's a slightly more enabling situation, 6 characters in search of an author, because those characters don't know what play they're meant to be in. And the nice thing about the Watsons is that everybody's cut off exactly at the point where they know exactly who they are, and wonder why they can't continue, or in some cases wonder when they get to start.
Yeah. But yes, it's a sort of great short idea.
Mm-hmm.
And
it didn't really work.
It didn't really work. I spent years. If you see the play, you can feel in the Laura character the many years of pain that have gone into trying to write it, draft after draft after draft, and I never quite got it right.
But you weren't initially in it.
No. Initially, that was even more embarrassing. Initially, the audience was supposed to intuit that Jane Austen had left the building at a certain point by kind of the set fell down.
I'm quite glad I didn't have to do it.
But yeah, and for years and years, and at the point when we met each other, I was still in absolutely tortured by this thing. It was really tricky.
We had a conversation that turned out to be quite enabling. I can't remember which of us suggested it, but I think it was more about turning the difficulties that you have into drama. So I suggested, or one of us suggested, dramatizing the difficulty and putting yourself into the play.
Yeah.
Which I think...
Which I resisted.
You resisted because you didn't want to put yourself in a play.
I didn't want to put myself in a play because I thought, what idiot would do that?
But we didn't have an antagonist.
No.
That was
and
the
actually
problem.
It really worked to dramatize Laura's struggle. Really worked to make that part of it. I gave them something to kick against and a sort of power structure.
Although dramaturgically there was also an important reverse, because initially in the second half people would bring ideas to Laura about what might happen, and Laura would reject them as not being interesting enough or not close enough to Jane Austen's intentions. And that sort of didn't work because it was a bit anti-joy. So then we turned that on its head, and instead Laura comes out with an agenda, which is by Jane Austen, which she wants the characters to do, and none of them want to do it. And that's a play.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't very much fun with that. Like, the characters kept coming in with all these fizzy ideas, and then Laura would just knock them down. It felt kind of dramatically deadening. And actually we came to the idea of wanting the second act to build and build and build and build and build to a climax, didn't we? So it was almost like a kind of improvisation game where you're not allowed to say no. You have to say yes. You have to invite the possibilities into the room and play with them. And that became quite an important guiding principle, didn't it, when we were rehearsing? Because
the company, as a company, you want them to succeed. They're in a situation that you can imagine happening. When Emma sits down and says, when I move my arm, it feels real. And Laura says, yes, it's a very good arm. Jane Austen's a very good. And we can all sort of feel the situation that she might be going through. And also, when we were teenagers, rather like the Truman Show, we've all imagined what it would be like to be in a play that you were the star of.
Well, and also I think that worked really well for us in terms of the whole rest of the company, because it's a cast of 16, 17 characters, and some of them are quite small. They don't have a great deal of time on stage or big speeches or whatever, but every single one of them, even when they're off stage, has to go through that same epiphany, don't they, of discovering that they're fictional and having to deal with that fact.
And then wondering if they've got anything to do.
Yeah, and am I going to be in the story now?
Yes.
And all of that stuff. And that really worked. It made all of the small characters really come alive, didn't it?
For Tom Musgrave, who's the cad, for instance, has a spell as a clergyman, has a spell as a DJ. That's fine for him. He loves it. He's trying on different hats. But Mrs. Robert, who's the social climber with the card room in Croydon, is rather at sea, because suddenly the horizon's got much bigger and she's a much smaller fish. Mm. I think we should talk a little bit about rehearsals, because I want to talk about meeting Catherine Sutherland, who was
our fairy godmother.
She was our fairy godmother, yes, and it is important when you're doing something like a Jane Austen adaptation, even an odd one like this, for somebody to come along and say, not exactly, I think she would have liked it, because I'm sure that's not sayable, but some of the things you're doing are like some of the things she did. Mm. Catherine, of course, has edited Jane Austen's Juvenilia and told us that the gender fluidity and the turning things on its head and the playful reversing of endings and reversal of expectations did remind her of a young, playful Jane Austen. And since what we had in the character of Emma was a very young and very rebellious sort of person who quite wanted to be Jane Austen when she discovered who Jane Austen was. We coupled that with a very important visit to the Jane Austen House Museum, where several things struck us. First of all, the smallness of the rooms. That was really important for the design. And if you haven't seen the play, go online and look for pictures of the Watsons. There's only really one picture that anyone uses, which is everybody packing into the tiny room at the end of Act One. And politically, it's quite hard when you dress something well to make a point about how a character is not very rich. Mm. But space is one way to do it. They don't have a lot of space, and putting a lot of people into a room suddenly makes it feel mean and a little bit poor. Of course, there's no such thing as really poor. We're talking about upper middle class. That tiny echelon that Jane Austen makes her expertise in.
We talk about a cottage, and it's actually a
16 rooms. Yeah,
house,
yeah, and their father has a living of £200 a year, so he's all right. But also the house had two things. That there was Jane Austen's father was a rector, and there's a framed picture on one of the walls of a marriage band certificate where she has crossed out, where she's filled in the names of all the characters of people she's imagining she might marry, and they're all the surnames of the heroines of her books. Sorry, no, the first names: Fitzwilliam and Henry, and there's even the heroes. Yeah, sorry, the heroes, not the heroines.
It's quite heartbreaking.
Yeah, exactly. And then of course there's the receipts of her accounts from her publishing, which proved what a serious businesswoman she was.
I think that the most important thing for me in that house was her writing desk, which is about 12 inches
tiny
round,
octagonal,
tiny little thing in the corner.
And she used to cover it up when people came over. Those of you who visited her grave in Winchester will remember that it doesn't mention on her gravestone that she was a writer. It seems quite extraordinary now. There's a memorial window from 100 years later next to it, which does mention it. And then there's a number of other memorials which talk about nothing else. But she's a good parson's daughter on her gravestone. We should talk about the manuscript.
Well, that's the other thing that Catherine did, isn't it? When she came into rehearsal, was talk very movingly, I found, about the manuscript itself and what we can learn from it in terms of this.
Yes. What about a piece of rewriting? Let's talk about a piece of rewriting that we know she did.
Yes, the thing that really interests me is the tininess of the writing in the manuscript, and the way that she applied patches cut out paper over the top of bits that she wanted to rewrite.
Yes.
But partly because, I mean, on a sort of solipsistic level, it's so completely different to my writing life, where I just sort of press delete a lot of times and go back to the beginning and start the sentence again. But we were struck by a few moments, weren't we, where she'd actually properly changed things.
Yes, let's go into one of those in a bit of detail. That would be good.
Yeah, where is it though? You've got it.
Have I?
Have I got it? No, it's here. Hang on.
It's on our table, excuse me. Yes, here we are. This is the scene between Lord Osborne and Emma when they first meet. You mean a compliment, of course, my lord, said Emma, bowing, though I do not exactly understand it. Lord Osborne laughed rather awkwardly and then said, upon my soul, I am a bad one for compliments. I wish I knew more of the matter. And after some minutes' silence added, can you not give me a lesson, Miss Watson, on the art of playing compliments? I should be very glad to learn. I want very much to know how to please the ladies, one lady at least. A cold monosyllable and grave look from Emma repressed the growing freedom of his manner. That does not survive because of an interpolated pinned piece, which revises it to this. And your lordship thinks we always have our own way. That is a point on which ladies and gentlemen have long disagreed. But without pretending to decide it, I may say that there are some circumstances which even women cannot control. Female economy will do a great deal, my lord, but it cannot turn a small income into a large one.
Which actually made its way into the script pretty
Almost
much verbatim, that, didn't it? I mean, as a side note, something really interesting about adapting Jane Austen is how very speakable her dialogue is. And most of the time when you adapt a novel, which I've done a few of, you tend to have to rewrite the dialogue because it reads well on the page, but then when an actor tries to read it out, it sounds a bit stiff and weird, and you have to sort of rough it up or make it a bit more natural. And actually most of the time, Jane Austen's dialogue, as long as you can get actors who have the fluency to sort of push through the longer sentences, just really flows. And here also she's chosen to give Emma something much stronger and more feminist, actually, about her circumstances, and just really clearly state in a way that doesn't worry about being polite.
But also fascinates Lord Osborne. At that moment, he looks at her in a way that he hasn't looked at her before.
Well, I don't think anybody talks to him like that.
No, nobody's ever talked to him like that. So, and this was a really important bit that actually we had, because of the manuscript that you helped to save. We were able to go back and say, here is Jane Austen's head in action, taking a cold monosyllable and turning it into a rather witty reply, which silences the man who becomes fascinated with her, and in our version will later ask her to marry him. And so we took that as an encouragement to take Emma in that direction. And so when Emma is finally challenged, and when she is completely cut free by Laura killing off her father, we took the things that are indicated by this rewrite, as Laura said, a freedom to speak, a beautiful clarity and wit, a growing feminist intuition, and let them rip. And we hope that made it feel modern, but at the same time rooted in something truthful and something that honoured the source material.
Should we talk a bit about unfinishedness?
Yes, we should talk about anything for about 3 minutes, and then we should stop.
And then we should find out what people actually want to know about.
Yes, unfinishedness. Yes, go on.
Well, just the question of why didn't Jane Austen finish the book hangs over, as I was saying earlier, is an important question in the book, and Emma needs to know, as a character, why didn't my author finish me? Why did she leave me hanging? And there is this sort of very interesting thing, as I was saying, about her not dying, about the fact that she put it away, and it seems like generally it's thought that she was at a very difficult point in her life, very unhappy, living in Bath with her family, which was not a happy place for her, and
they'd had to retrench.
Yeah, and her father getting very ill, and and actually
her real life father.
Her real life father, and the circumstances of Emma in the book and Elizabeth, I think possibly even more poignantly Elizabeth, because Elizabeth's about the same age at 28 that Jane Austen was, isn't that right? That it was a bit too close.
13 years, yes, exactly.
Uncomfortably real.
Yes.
For Jane Austen. And actually in the manuscript, those people who know it will remember that it tails off rather, that we get to a point where Emma is in quite a depressed place and she's sitting with her father reading to him rather than being downstairs playing cards with the rest of the family. And it ends on rather a minor note.
That's an extraordinary passage, actually. It's a very... I'm not an expert. I've read almost all the novels and I've been in one of them, but it seems to me that Austen manages to keep some sort of enabling distance, rather like an actor would want to, between who they are and who they're writing about. And at that point, when she's writing Emma reading to her father, it gets too close for comfort. And there is no longer, as it were, a mask. There's no longer any distance between who she is and who she's writing about. And it all rather, as you say, runs down. And it feels very like, well, nowadays you would call it depression. And then, of course, in January 1805, her father dies. And the book is never finished. She reuses bits. She reuses the name of the heroine in a novel, and a number of other little situations. And
I mean, I think more of a problem is that I think that what she's done is that none of the suitors, none of the men that she's written turn out to be good enough for the heroine, because Emma's a really good heroine.
Yes.
And the boys are all a bit disappointing. And certainly one of the things that I found in doing the adaptation was, if I was going to attempt to finish it, because I had to think through that version of trying to finish it, even though I knew I didn't want to, who did I want her to end up with? Because they were all a bit lacking. So therefore, what was Jane Austen planning to do in the rest of the book in order to bring one of them up to a high enough quality
for
Emma to marry?
That's what's so good about you could call it a trick, but the enabling idea that we choose to set free. I mean, I suppose if I had to bet my house on it, I would say that it is Jane Austen's personal circumstance that stops her writing. But in fact, you can't really sell that in a play that's meant to be joyous and have a happy ending. So you have to say she did it deliberately. And if she'd finished you, you'd only have one ending. And because she hasn't finished you, you can choose what you want to do.
As many as you want.
And of course, that's also delightful for the actors, because nobody really wants to play a type. You could say, in fact, when they're discussing who to marry, Emma says, Tom Musgrave, because he's very attractive. And Laura says, no, he's the cad. And she says, sorry? She says, well, Mr. Elliot, Wickham. No, she hasn't read any of those books, so she doesn't know what a cad is. But of course, if you're playing Tom Musgrave, you don't particularly just want to be the cad. So Lawrence Ubon Williams, who played him, was delightful in that he came and he did his homework. We did a lot of. I must talk a little bit about homework, but then he was able to cut free from the wingman who had to do everything that his boss told him and really have fun. And that was actually something that we did a lot in rehearsals. And this was why we started with Catherine, because we worked with this book a lot. Jane Austen, The World of Her Novels by Deirdre LaFay, which has an enormous amount of detail on everything from chairs to candles to early shower baths to where and how people peed. And I wanted the characters absolutely to have that down so that we could give, even if quickly and even if sketched in, a really good account of a life that they felt embedded in, so that they could play the character, so that they could play the situation and not the character. Because that's, when you do an adaptation, you think everybody's playing a type a bit and you want to leave that alone. There's
so much code in Jane Austen, isn't there? There's so much, contemporary references in the same way that when, we talk about in the modern world, when we say a man drives a Porsche, we know in an instant what that means about that person.
Well, Lawrence came in one day and gave us a lecture on the difference between a curricle and
a broom.
And a broom, yeah. Because it would absolutely be a code for him.
Yeah.
And it was very important for us, for instance, to know that when a man had offered marriage, that he wasn't allowed to break off the engagement. That was the first and possibly the only moment of power that a woman had. So to get him to say, "Will you marry me?" becomes a really important moment in the story. And once he said it, Emma can then go away and think about it because she knows he can't take it back.
Yeah.
Is that enough? No.
I think, I mean, if we're talking about unfinished things, but we could finish, couldn't we? And throw over to the audience.
About 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Left.
I was congratulating you on a wonderful conversation.
Oh,
Thank you very, very much indeed for bringing us those insights into your adaptation and your, I mean, it's more than an adaptation, it's an extension, it's your own creation of and completion of this play.
Well, you just reminded me of what to say, thank you.
And I think we have a number of questions, and the first one I'm going to call on is a question from John Ratnaswamy. And John, are you with us? Are you able to give us your question?
Yes.
Hello, John.
Yes, hello.
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 So I'm sorry to start this off with a silly question, but Mr. West, when you did your Jane Austen murder weekend, Midsummer Murders, a few years ago, had the two of you met? Had you discussed that she was working on adapting the Watsons?
Yes. In fact, it was very odd because this, for those of you who don't know, this is a sort of Death Comes to Pemberley style murder mystery set in a Jane Austen world of Midsummer Murders, which of course, runs out of people to murder, so they have to keep inventing more and more wild situations. But no, we were still working on the Watsons at that time, but we hadn't done it. Is that right?
I don't think we'd actually done the play yet, but it was going to happen when you, because it's only like 2 years ago, wasn't it, that you did that?
No, it's a few more.
We had at least one child. We may not have had two by then.
I mean, one of the things we should say is that at this point we were discussing with the literary department at Chichester Festival Theatre, who I eventually sent it to. Actually, this should be said, that one of the reasons it happened this play is that I slightly sent it behind Laura's back to Chichester, because we argued about it so much. I always had faith in it, and Laura had had so much grief writing it that she didn't want to finish it. We knew that something in the second half didn't quite work. And I kept saying, listen, this is a great idea. I pitched it to people, just over dinner at things, and they love it. You've got to finish it. And she said, I don't want to talk about it. Stop talking about it. So I sent it to Chichester.
I think there was more swearing in it than that, actually.
I sent it to Chichester, and they said, oh, this is great. We want to do this. I said, well, the second act doesn't quite work yet. And they said, it doesn't matter. We'll find it. We'll sort it. We'll put it on. And at that point, when you say we'll put it on to a writer who's had a problem writing something, they go, oh, right. So not the runt of my litter, but in fact, something I've got to get ready for next August. And at that point, you have to think, okay, let's solve Act 2. And the literary department came in and said,
Kate Bassett,
let's be honest, and said, look, when they're talking in the second act, can they talk about Locke and Rousseau, please? Because, and can we bring in the French Revolution a bit?
And the social contract.
And the social contract. And we went, oh God, we better go and Wikipedia those now. And she was absolutely right. And other things like Midsummer Murders and Pride and Prejudice and Zombies and all that other stuff, because there is such a meta-theatrical industry around Austen, became important. And we reread a lot of the refinishings, which I'm sure Catherine has read a few of.
I didn't actually, you did.
No, I did.
You read them for me.
I read them for them. Now, this is interesting because the Watsons wasn't originally published. One of the reasons we have the manuscript is because it wasn't published. And when Jane Austen had published a book, she gets rid of the manuscript. It's done, it's finished, which is another reason to support the idea that because it's unpublished, the options are open. But we had, sorry, lost my train of thought about extending and refinishing. Oh, help me.
Kate Bassett talking about Rousseau and Locke, and
it doesn't matter. Keep going. Oh yes, yes. I reread all the refinishings.
Okay, yeah.
And they're all terribly much of their time. So there's a Victorian refinishing, which concentrates on Mr. and Mrs. Roberts' daughter, who's called Alicia or something. Augusta, who's not really in our adaptation at all. But because there was a Victorian child in it, they thought she was great. And then there's a 1920s adaptation, which is rather fast, and then there's a 1950s adaptation, which is rather domestic. And we thought, okay, well, this is just like when you do, if you look at the 1972 version of Persuasion, which is the good BBC adaptation before our adaptation in 1995, everybody's got the right sideburns, but they're a bit long, and the women have got slight touches of blue eyeshadow. And you can tell that it's 1814 through 1972.
That's so interesting about adaptation, though, because all adaptations do that, is filtered through the time in which it's being written or is being written for.
That happened actually with the music I'm doing. I have to tell you one thing about I mentioned a rave. I thought that it would be really good at the end to have them dancing to a number called A Fifth of Beethoven, which is a disco mix of Beethoven's Fifth, which puts a drum basically a drum soundtrack over the opening theme, ba 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 bum, and it's from Saturday Night Fever, which is 1977. And Beethoven's Fifth is written in 1803, which is the date of the watermark of the paper that the Watsons is written on. And me going, oh, fantastic, it's a great tie-in. And I played it to the company, and they went, what's this dinosaur music? Because they're all much too young. And they said to me, this is 1977. We weren't born in 1977. We need grime, we need garage, we need now. This has got, and so one of them put something on their iPad, on their iPhone, and put it through the speakers, and everybody started nodding. And that's the music we used. And I realized that moment was a sort of perfect encapsulation of what needed to happen in the story, that I was trying to get them into a proper period box. And they were saying, no, I don't want to get into that box. The duvet's not going in there. You've got to do it our way.
And it became theirs.
And it became theirs.
Way, didn't it?
It was really good. Yeah. It was a perfect moment.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's not really answered your question at all, but it's thrown.
Thank you.
Not at all.
Well, I'm going to ask another question now. I'm going to invite another question. That's from Chris Fletcher, Keeper of Special Collections in the Bodleian. Chris.
Thank you very much. So there's nothing like actors, dramatists and producers for really understanding a literary text. It's been wonderful. And also thank you, Sam, for your poetry and pandemic Twitter feed. It's wonderful, a great consolation.
Thank you.
Really beautiful. But Laura, you mentioned that you wrote draft after draft. And
yes, you can't have them.
Yep.
I've got one here, 50 pages longer.
That was sort of my question. But yeah, I just wonder what happens to all of that work, personally for you and maybe for Sam as well. All that working through, all the prep. What do you do with it? Shakespeare never kept anything.
No.
No. Do you mean into the sheer actual paper?
Yeah.
Trail. Yeah, I mean, I keep it in boxes, and it accumulates and accumulates, and writers always have their own thing, but I have, you know, a certain kind of notebook that I always use, and each play will have, by the end of I've done it, will have 5 or 6 of these notebooks that I've just sort of done my thinking on paper in, and then there'll be any number of differently named drafts on the computer. And
I have a printed version.
You never go back to any of it.
No.
Of course, you mentioned Bristol, which has an absolutely superb theatre collection.
Yes, yes.
But
this is the 2017 draft, which is 120 pages, which is 40 pages longer than the one we ended up with. I'm quite easily bored.
Yeah, we can get it to a good length, but no, I think those things. I mean, it's funny because it's almost as if as soon as a new draft happens, all of the older ones kind of cease to exist. And it can be quite weird. I find it even more with writing film sometimes now, is that you have a lot more different drafts, and I'll go, oh, didn't we have something like that in like 3 drafts ago? Sometimes you can copy and paste it out and put it back in without telling the producers. But usually the thing that you've got, it's like, we quite often, don't we end up cutting things in previews of a show, and it gets things just sort of, you find you don't need once you get them in front of an audience, or they don't work, or you just chop them out, kind of thing. And it's a bit like tightening the corset strings. Or sometimes you're just cutting stuff because it's too long, and you think you don't want the second half to be 100 minutes. You'd rather it was 70 or 60, in fact, 55. And the funny thing is that you never miss those things once they've gone, because the joy of having this tighter waist, as it were, this more cleaner thing, is so much better. So you kind
I have to say, not all writers think this.
Well, I never regret cutting stuff, but you have to have gone through it somehow. You have to have gone through the longer drafts.
Laura came to rehearsals for the first run. I should say a bit about that we had not only young children of our own, but the person playing Laura and the person playing Miss Osborne had young children. And so for the first time ever, I programmed rehearsals very precisely. I worked out how many times I wanted to run through the play. I worked out how many times we wanted to talk to people like Catherine. We programmed them. They were our carrots. They were our treats at the end of the day. And I stuck to it. And the result was that Laura came in for the first run through of all the scenes. And when she realized we weren't going to screw it up, she left us alone. And they were very joyous times, weren't they? Which is why we're still here, really, and still thinking about, how it might be improved if we ever put it back together. I have given some of my scripts to the Shakespeare Institute, including the script of Hamlet and the script of Richard II. When I did Hamlet, I played him for a year, and I went through 2 very, very big notebooks and couldn't talk about anything else for about 18 months, 6 months before and the whole run. And so I thought, well, you might as well have it. And then I had you mentioned at the beginning, Richard, the production of Dealer's Choice that I had. And I made some notes on casting. And I said, okay, you can have my script of Dealer's Choice, but you don't want my notes about casting. I mean, things like OMDB, which stands for Over My Dead Body. I can't say that about anybody. That's still inequity. And they said, and Michael Dobson, who you may know, who runs the Shakespeare Institute, said, yes, but think how interesting it would be if we had a list of the people in Shakespeare's company and what he thought of them. And I thought, okay, can you have that and then release it publicly when I'm dead, please? So that's what they did. So they've got that.
At this point, can I, because we've got a couple more questions and we're running out of time, so I'm going to ask Mary Pritchard to ask her question, which I think leads quite nicely on from that comment about sources. Mary.
I don't know if you can see me. I've only just, can you hear me? I've only just unmuted.
Yes, we can hear and see you. Hello.
Right. Of course, I haven't seen the Watsons, but I have seen Posh live. And you started making me think about the difference between the constraint of working with a given text and that the honor that you did to the existing text before you moved off into Wilder Flights of Fancy, and the constraint of working with documentary sources, because I was fascinated by Posh and how you had worked with things like the court case of the guy who ran the pub that they trashed. And stuff, there was quite a lot of journalism around, and I wondered how those different sorts of use of a source work for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny with actually at the time when I first wrote Posh, there didn't seem to be very much journalism around.
So it's your fault.
Well, because it was 2007. It was just when Cameron was bubbling up, and so it wasn't quite as hugely in the ether as it is now. You know, now if you go online, you can find that famous Bullingdon Club photograph reproduced thousands and thousands of times, for example. But it was quite hard to get hold of back then. And that there wasn't very much around. And one of the funny things about Posh is that it's very fictional. It's based on the kind of the bare bones of the idea that those boys at that time, that particular instance, went into a pub and trashed it, and the guy called the police and was the first person that had ever really said no to them. But that was kind of all the bare bones that we took of it, and then went and created this sort of fictional group of people.
You did talk to quite a lot of people who'd been in the Bullingdon, didn't you?
Yeah, or other clubs, because there's quite a lot of other clubs that sort of are similar. But also quite a lot of was just sort of, I mean, I like to do just enough research to then be able to make stuff up. So to sort of, you know, to release the fiction, and actually some of the fiction turns out with that play to be surprisingly well, truer than you expect. But yeah, so it was more that, really. It was more kind of releasing the sort of fictional tribe, and imagining, you know, you put 10 boys in that room, and by the end of the evening this happens, and what has to happen in the room, because nobody knew what has to happen in that room in order for that thing to explode. So it's kind of like building a bomb, really. Like, what do I need to put in?
I was going to say cake, as long as it explodes.
What do you need to put in order for it to explode at the right point in the evening, really, on a kind of forensic level?
My father says you should always do as much research as you can, because even if only 10% is useful, the more you do, the bigger the 10% is.
Yes.
Which is great, but that means that at some point you read a book about Richard III and you're playing Richard III, and it says, well, he didn't have a hump and he was really nice. And you think, well, he has got a hump and he isn't very nice. What do I do now? Yeah. So at some point it has to stop.
Yeah, it's finding the balance between being sort of willfully ignorant, having done a responsible amount of research.
I remember a moment when
being beholden to it.
When we were remounting the play for the Chocolate Factory, our second season, which was the launching pad for what would be the West End now. We had a wonderful idea that Elizabeth should give Emma an old dance card as she's leaving, and just so she could take her, an old one that Elizabeth doesn't use anymore. And we completely fell in love with this idea, choreographed it, researched dance cards, discovered they didn't come in until about 15 years after Jane Austen died, and abandoned the idea. We had to. Because somebody that was it was in 2 hours. It was a brief but brilliant relationship with the idea of dance cards, but you have to leave it behind because otherwise somebody will write in.
Yeah.
Well, this is actually the perfect time to bring our last question in, and I'm going to ask our mutual friend, Professor Catherine Sutherland, who is also a member of the Council of the Friends of the Bodleian, to ask her question, which is actually about escaping your sources and the kind of freedom that brings. So, Catherine, do you want to ask it yourself?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Hello.
Hi, Laura. Hi, Sam. Thank you both so much for rising so brilliantly to this strange challenge that we've set you here. As you know, I'm a huge fan of the play, and loved the performance I saw at Chichester. You mentioned the reason passed down in Jane Austen's family for why she may not have finished the novel, if it was a novel, because we don't even know if it was a novel, of course, because it's no chapters or anything. The reason was that it became so close to life that somehow life and fiction both trapped her, and she couldn't see any way through and any way to finish. Your play, on the other hand, is all about escape. And it's gloriously about escape at every stage, and especially that wonderful celebration of escape at the end. And it seems to me to a play about escaping sources and the expectations that sources might build in the audience. And in a sense, that solves Austen's problem, of course, for her, because you've given her an escape. But what it made me wonder, and I hadn't really thought about this before, is whether you might think that escaping the source might be a kind of key more generally to successful adaptation. You know, people talk about being faithful to sources a lot, don't they? But maybe escaping the source is actually a more intelligent way of approaching adaptation.
That's a fascinating question.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think, I mean, for me, when I'm adapting for the theatre, I'm always looking for a way of telling that story that is extremely strongly theatrical. And quite often, if you're doing a big fat novel, you know, you can't possibly include all of it.
Yeah.
So you have to choose you have to choose a strand through it, and keep everything that attaches to that strand, and anything that doesn't attach to that narrative strand, you have to let go. And so it's absolutely your interpretation of that novel.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, we've all seen adaptations that feel like they're just an attempt to rocket through a story really quickly in the course of an evening, so we don't have to read it again, and we get to see the frog.
Exactly. Yeah.
There are a few BBC ones.
Yep. But it should never feel like that. It should be. It should become its own thing. So it's a relationship between the source text and the adapter, and the play kind of hovers in the middle. And, you know, then also sometimes if you've got the source text, you've then also got a living writer. And so then you've got a whole kind of circle of relationships between things.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, absolutely that you have to have the confidence that the adaptation can be its own thing, and that it's not the only adaptation possible.
Yeah.
That someone else might see it completely differently, and
that was why
it lives its own life. It lives its own life.
Well, that was why I wasn't disappointed when people left at the interval. Those two people, I think only two people did, saying they have no intention of finishing it, because what they meant was they have no intention of finishing it in its 1803 circumstance, in a way that we can't see the join, and it might be Jane Austen. I thought, well, there are other versions of that, but as I've already described, they betray the time they were written in. And there is another reason, which you've just described beautifully, where Jane Austen, you know, was almost closed down, almost wound down by depression, I think. So I wanted to. I mean, we all knew the source text extremely well. We could all draw maps of the town, and we went into incredible detail about the characters' lives, so that we could then drive a truck into it. Because if it wasn't real, then nobody cared, and also the people who'd come to see the Watsons didn't feel they'd had a proper go at it. So it was also quite interesting casting those sort of people, because you need actors who can really do the Austen, but then actually can also have arguments about Locke and You Killed My Father.
That was what was so impressive about working with your actors, is how much they knew about the Austen.
Oh, good.
How they got inside the characters.
Oh, I'll tell them that. They'll be absolutely chuffed. As you can imagine, they're sort of sitting around a bit like the characters in the Watsons, going, well, what do we do now?
They are a bit,
No, I feel so sorry for them. Yeah.
They'll be back.
They will be back.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I fear that at this point of the evening, if we were in the Sheldonian Theatre for the annual lecture, I would be standing up at this point and giving a vote of thanks to our distinguished speakers. And I'm going to try to do that in these rather odd circumstances of being online. Unfortunately, we don't have our delicious tea to go to after the lecture in the Divinity School, but I would just like to thank Laura and Sam enormously for an incredible insight into their unique production, and it's only a great pity that we're not able to see it, and we fervently hope that the West End Theatre will be able to stage it again, or to stage it anew. I had the pleasure of being encouraged and urged by Professor Sutherland for the Bodleian to put its hat in the ring when the manuscript came up for auction. And Chris Fletcher and I spent many weeks leading up to the auction date to filling in application forms, talking to funding bodies, encouraging the philanthropy of the Friends of the Bodleian and others. And it's been wonderful to see that play come to the surface, or to see the text come to the surface and emerge as your play. And if that's the only reason for acquiring the play, that would be acquiring the manuscript, then that would be good enough. So, but there've been numerous other uses. We had the pleasure of taking it on exhibition to New York, where we were able to reunite it with the few pages that they have in the Morgan Library that were given away by one of Jane Austen's descendants to raise money for war veterans in the First World War. So for a few months, what survives of it came back together. But it was an incredibly exciting moment to acquire the manuscript. And it's such a shame that you weren't able to come with your crew, your cast, to actually see it in the Bodleian. So that's a date to be reset, and come and have a play with that and some other Austen material that we have, and some other wonderful dramatic manuscripts and early books too. So that I'd like to re-extend that invitation. But the annual lecture has been held since 1925, and this is most definitely breaking new ground for us. And I think that as your play, your adaptation of the Watsons breaks new ground for Jane Austen, I think it's very fitting that you should break new ground for the Friends of the Bodleian Annual Lecture by holding it for us, not only in digital form, but by colluding with your children to remain quiet during the past hour, which is a feat of great skill, which I commend.
No, we can take them out of the freezer now.
But thank you very, very much indeed for giving us that wonderful insight into your production and to its genesis and to what was going through your minds as you set it out. And all that's missing now is for us to book our tickets for when it is once more staged, and we're all just waiting to hear the dates when it will come to fruition again. So we urge you and encourage you to go through with it, and look forward to that very much indeed. So ladies and gentlemen, please bang your tables, clap, make whatever sounds you can in your homes, but generally applaud Laura Wade and Sam West. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for the 2020 edition of the Friends of the Bodleian Annual Lecture. We cannot wait to see you in person again, and look forward to the next occasion when we can all gather in the hallowed portals of the Bodleian Library. Please stay safe, everyone, and enjoy what's left of the evening. Thank you.